Hi, everyone, distinguished guests. On behalf of the experts in international trade at the Chamber of Commerce of Metropolitan Montreal, we welcome you to our webinar of the Desjardins International Meeting Series. Today's topic is an overview of the international development market, spotlight on the International Financial Corporation. My name is Dina Mansour. I am an advisor for international market development at the Chamber of Commerce of Metropolitan Montreal. Our speakers today are Laura Dorling van der Oord, Senior Advisor at the Office of the Executive Director for Canada, Ireland, and the Caribbean at the World Bank Group, Faheem Noor Ali, Climate Finance Trade Commissioner at the Embassy of Canada in Washington, and Shari Friedman, Senior Climate Strategist at the Climate Strategy and Business Unit at the IFC. I would like to use this time to thank our partners, starting with Desjardins, our principal sponsor, as well as our collaborators, Export Development Canada and La Presse, who made this webinar possible, as well as Economic Development Agency of Canada for the region of Quebec for its ongoing support of World Trade Center Montreal's activities. Please note that there is currently an ongoing poll. If you can answer it, it will be greatly appreciated to help us keep track of our internal goals. If you have any questions to our panelists, you can write them down in the designated Q&A box located in the bottom center of your screen, and we will address them towards the end of the webinar. You may ask your question in the official language of your choosing, and I will be happy to translate for you if needed. Veuillez prendre note que ce webinaire est en anglais. Toutefois, si vous avez des questions en français, vous pouvez les poser. Il me fera plaisir de les traduire à nos panélistes en temps réel, si vous vous sentez plus à l'aise de les poser en français. You will also receive a short survey that will appear in your browser at the end for your satisfactions, which we invite you to answer to gather up your opinion for future events. I will also send you a follow-up email, which will include the presentation used today. Also, if you would like to watch the webinar again, we will make the recording available on the Chamber of Commerce of Metropolitan Montreal website, as well as our YouTube page. I also want to give a special thanks for the Embassy of helping us in setting up this series of webinar on the International Financial Institution. So let me start by introducing our first speaker, Laura Dorling van der Oord. She joined the Office of the Executive Director for Canada, Ireland, and the Caribbean at the World Bank Group in July 2012. In her role as an advisor, she maintains board-level responsibilities and helps shape and approve investment in developing countries financed by the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, and the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. She also manages private sector programming and client engagement to promote global markets for procurement and investment opportunities in developing countries, increase flows of private capital to emerging markets, and support the World Bank Group's efforts to maximize financing for development. So, Laura, you now have the floor.
Great. Thank you so much, Dina, and good morning to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today, albeit virtually. I really wanted to extend a special thank you to the Chamber of Commerce of Metropolitan Montreal and to dear colleagues at Global Affairs Canada for helping to pull together this session today, and to all of you for making the time to learn a little bit more about the International Finance Corporation. Looking at several of the registrants, it's clear that some of you already know IFC quite well, and there are others of you who may find that it's the first time you're getting to learn a bit more about the International Finance Corporation, or IFC. So we'll be sure to cover off some details here. For some of you, more basic details, and certainly we'll have the opportunity to get into more depth as to some of the current priorities and areas of activity we're seeing at the IFC. So with that being said, first I wanted to introduce IFC as the largest global development institution focused on the private sector in developing countries. And I think that it's worth mentioning, again, that IFC is a member of the World Bank Group. And in fact, there are 185 countries, including Canada, as shareholders of the IFC. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C., although with a very global presence with 102 offices in 95 countries, with majority of staff actually based outside of Washington. So quite an international presence and very global footprint. Ultimately, we focus on investment, advice, and resource mobilization, all with the interest of supporting the private sector in developing countries. And with that being said, we have experience with debt and investment in emerging markets in the private sector for over 60 years now. So clearly a leader in this space. And in fact, my understanding is that IFC had originally coined the term emerging market. So it gives you an idea of how early involved IFC has been in the space. To start with, I wanted to really highlight one important point here, that is the fact that IFC funding eligibility is really for projects that are in the private sector and importantly in developing countries. Projects need to be really technically sound with good prospects of profitability and also development impact, and also meet certain standards for environmental and social standards, IFC performance standards that we may have a chance to discuss a bit later through the Q&A. If we can go to the next slide, for those of you who are more familiar with the World Bank Group, I just wanted to remind you again that IFC is the primary private sector arm of the World Bank Group. This is where we do invest directly into the private sector in company level investments. I want to just put this in the spectrum of the overall offering of the World Bank Group. So many of you have attended earlier sessions we've done to promote work with the World Bank, meaning mainly the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and also the International Development Association, where we're then lending and supporting projects at the country level to governments directly. The case of IFC, again, just keep in mind that we're looking at solutions in private sector development, and this is where we can provide investment and advisory services to firms directly. Again, with that overall mission to promote global development through investment in the private sector. So if we go to the next slide, I think during these unprecedented times, it's certainly worth highlighting really an extraordinary response that we've seen through the World Bank Group's COVID-19 response. In recent months, since the start of this pandemic, the World Bank Group has really rallied to be at the forefront of the global response. And just to give you an idea of the operational response that we've been able to put in place, we're basically putting as much capital as possible together to help countries combat the impact of COVID-19. And in fact, we're aiming to provide up to $160 billion in financing, really to help address both the health impacts but also the economic and social shocks that countries have been facing. So to put this in context, on the World Bank side, certainly for the poorest countries, that's where we're looking at allocating $50 billion in financing on grant and highly concessional terms to help these countries make their own necessary investments to combat COVID-19. In the case of IFC has also been playing really an unprecedented role here, where we've been able to approve a package of $8 billion to help companies really continue to operate and sustain jobs during this crisis. There's no doubt that the private sector has taken a big hit in terms of the level of economic impact, in terms of business opportunities. And so IFC has been playing a really critical role to be able to help make some liquidity available. So for instance, I've included there some highlights as to how we've allocated some of that funding. But for instance, we've been able to make some real sector investments that was approved for $2 billion. Also, the global trade finance program that was already in place was able to expand and be able to provide another $2 billion. Also, we realized that working capital was really an urgent need to help companies that suddenly had seen a decline in some of their otherwise anticipated revenues. So there's another $2 billion allocation, and for global trade liquidity as well, $2 billion. I think worth highlighting here as well that IFC also had launched a new global health platform, and this was really innovative, really to help expand our existing toolkit to be able to help expand access to medical supplies initially and currently, including for masks, ventilators, test kits, and of course, much needed COVID-19 vaccines. So we're expecting to see some continued involvement there. If we go to the next slide, I just wanted to give you a sense of what we've done, not only in terms of the COVID-19 response, but beyond. If you look at IFC fiscal year highlights, this is for fiscal year 2020. I should say that in the next couple of weeks, we will be closing fiscal year 2021 with June 30th as our end of fiscal year date. But if you look at what we had been able to allocate, we have $21.9 billion in long-term investments in IFC's fiscal year 2020. So that was including $11.1 billion of IFC's own accounts, plus an additional $10.8 billion that was mobilized. So right now, in the terms of the figures for fiscal year 2020, we have a total of 58.7 billion committed portfolio. Unfortunately, we don't have the new fiscal figures in yet or approved as of yet, but we will be receiving those shortly. And as you can imagine, we'll expect to see continued reflection of the scope of activity, again, in the context of the current ongoing pandemic and important investments being made in areas such as climate. So delighted we'll have the chance today to learn more about that. If we go to the next slide, I just wanted to be able to touch a bit on the role of our office. As I mentioned, Canada is a very important shareholder at the International Finance Corporation. And in fact, in our office, as Dana had mentioned, we're representing a multiple constituency. So we actually represent 13 countries, including Canada and Ireland, and 11 of the Caribbean countries, mainly English-speaking Caribbean countries, with the exception of Trinidad and Tobago, as you can see in the slide. And just to focus here that our primary responsibilities, as you would expect at the level of the board of directors, is really around the fiduciary responsibility, the financial sustainability of the IFC and the other World Bank Group institutions, really representing our member countries on the board of directors, and also reviewing and approving the lending and investments that are made through the World Bank, IFC, and MIGA. And of course, we do like to focus on specific areas for board involvement, including around particular areas such as governance, development effectiveness, and of course, risk management. So if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to give you a flavor of some of the examples of Canadian priorities, sort of highlighting where we have this strong partnership with Canada at the IFC. Some examples include innovative development finance. And for instance, Canada has been a real leader at the forefront here of using catalytic donor funding in the area of blended finance and climate finance to help drive additional private sector investment. And we're also focused on mobilization of private capital, recognizing that we need to be using any and all means of capital allocation to help move the needle on these much needed climate investments and beyond for development impact. We also have a feminist international development policy, and that's really being put in action through our work with IFC as well, in terms of work being done to advance gender equality and women's economic empowerment, and including from a lens of peace and security, looking more at fragile and conflict states. And of course, another really important area for us is supporting the private sector engagement. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you my colleague Faheem Noor Ali, who is a Climate Finance Trade Commissioner. We work very closely together in person and virtually these days, given his role at the Canadian Embassy. And it's really my pleasure to turn over to Faheem at this time, and very much look forward to hearing from his presentation and Shari's as well. Thanks so much.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Laura. And as Laura had mentioned, we work very closely with Laura and the Executive Director's Office, and it's been a great relationship. So welcome. My name is Faheem Noor Ali. Thank you to all of the panelists and participants for joining. I'll go into a little bit about myself. As Laura had mentioned, I'm a Climate Finance Trade Commissioner based out of the Embassy of Canada in Washington, D.C., as you can sort of see our embassy in the picture in the top left. Just briefly, if you're not familiar with the Trade Commissioner Service, the Trade Commissioner Service actually helps companies navigate the complexities of international markets. We're in 160 countries worldwide, and we gain market intelligence, uncover opportunities for Canadian companies, and help reduce business costs and risks. It's a free service of the Government of Canada, helping companies to prepare for international markets, assess market potential, and find qualified contacts. So in that vein, our role, so my role as a Climate Finance Trade Commissioner and my colleagues in the Office of Liaison International Finance Institutions, we exclusively focus on the IFIs. So World Bank Group, which includes IFC, the IDB group, which includes IDB Invest or Inter-American Development Bank, Asia Development Bank, et cetera. I specifically focus on the Caribbean and Latin America, but being in Washington, I do work with people like Shari and others at IFC to see where there's opportunities for you to go global. So if we could go to the next slide. So I wanted to start out by just talking about why climate finance is significant. And I think that will blend well into what Shari is also going to talk about. So the estimated climate flows were about $622 billion in 2019. I think new numbers will come out soon as to how the pandemic has affected those numbers. But apparently, approximately $22.6 trillion was committed by different countries under the Paris Agreement for underlying policies in 21 developing countries. As many of you know, this year, we're going to re-look at these commitments 5 years later at COP26, and we should find that many countries will sort of start putting out their commitments soon. We've already seen commitments from the US government and the Canadian government and others on reducing carbon emissions in the next 20 to 30 years. But currently, Canada is delivering on its pledge to provide $2.65 billion in climate finance. This includes some of the aspects that Laura had mentioned, such as blended finance and climate finance as well. Can we go to the next slide, please? So as I mentioned, I work closely with OLIFI, the Office of Liaison of International Finance Institutions, and we really are a close-knit team. We sit right next to each other, and we basically look at how we can help Canadian companies work with the World Bank Group, whether that's IIBRD, IFC, MIGA, and of course the other institutions outside of the World Bank Group as well. So we're all based out of Washington, DC. Like I said in the introduction of the Trade Commissioner Service, we assess your market potential to work with the multilateral development banks and then identify qualified contacts within the multi-development banks. We help resolve problems, most largely that falls on the procurement side. If there's sort of something going on with how the procurement process has gone, we can always look at to see how we can resolve that. And this is where we actually have our close relationship with the Executive Director's Office and others really helps. And then we can coordinate participation in key events, sector-specific trade missions, and side programs. I've personally gone to the Caribbean Renewable Energy Forum 2 or 3 times when it was in Miami and virtually. We organized number of virtual events over the course of the last year, and set up side events or side meetings for Canadian companies at some of these major conferences. And hopefully, as travel picks up toward the end of the year, we'll be able to bring people from the IFIs to Canada for you to meet, and then disseminate opportunities. So this graphic on the bottom really sort of shows how closely we work with OLIFI. As my title suggests, climate finance looks at investment in climate finance, but I do work with different programs within the World Bank, such as the SMAP program, and make connections into that program, which is the electricity service program. And then our colleagues at OLIFI will also work with a number of these programs, and we'll focus across the whole gamut outside of climate. And go to the next slide. So we are co-located with the major international finance institutions. So here in Washington, we have the World Bank Group, IDB, and a number of the US agencies such as USAID and the Development Finance Corporation, which is formerly OPIC. We have a colleague in Bridgetown who sits next to the Caribbean Development Bank and has very strong contacts there. In London, we have a climate finance trade commissioner that focuses on opportunities in Europe, particularly if you're looking for financing from the European institutions Rachel is your best contact, and she works closely with EBRD and EIB. Abidjan, we have both an OLIFI officer and a climate finance officer that sits next to the Africa Development Bank. We have an OLIFI officer in Beijing with the Asia Infrastructure Bank, and in Manila, we have a climate finance officer and an OLIFI officer with the Asia Development Bank. So we definitely cover all of the different banks, and we have strong contacts. Like I had said in the beginning, the Tri-Commissioner Service is a free service of the Canadian government, and really the way I like to describe it is we're sort of that tax-paid business development role for Canadian companies. So if you go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, there's two sort of ways to work with these institutions. The first is procurement opportunities, and this is really where my colleagues at OLIFI are the experts. So all procurement that coming out of the World Bank group follows strict guidelines set by the World Bank group. And country office trade commissioners are aware of the procurement opportunities coming from IFI loans. And then, often we get questions on sole sourcing opportunities. They are pretty limited and they are capped. So, they are available, but in a very limited form. So what we do from the Trade Commissioner Service is we help you find the procurement opportunities by providing intelligence on new opportunities. That includes us going to a number of the conferences that are hosted by the institutions, connecting you to qualified contacts, and advice on how to best position the companies when you're presenting capabilities. And part of our job also is, for all of Canadian industries, really highlighting the capabilities of what Canada can do, particularly around some of the climate opportunities that are coming up, because there is a really good expertise. For example, Sean Whitaker, who's at IFC and a colleague of Shari's, mentioned that it's almost an unfair advantage of how much experience Canada has in wind. So this is where we can really be helpful. So on the investment side, whether it's IFC, IDB, Invest, EFC, they're always looking for an investable pipeline that shows social, environmental, and financial impact. And as Laura said, focused on developing markets or in client countries. In general, and this is very general, they tend to favor larger ticket projects, which is, I would say, in excess of $10 million, and don't necessarily fund over 50% of the project. The exceptions are, around fragile and conflict states, or sort of specific key priorities. And then, of course, that varies by sector too. So I would take this number as a very general number, but a good guideline. And as we had mentioned earlier, Canada does provide investment funds to the IFIs for them to use at their discretion. That includes the blended finance funds. So again, our role here is to help with intelligence and provide you with opportunities that have come up. For example, in the past year, IFC has had a couple of opportunities around cooling and tourism that Canadian companies have participated in, and we've connected them to some of the right people as they're preparing their applications. And then finding the right investment officers to talk to and helping continue the conversation, and actually looking at some of the presentations that you will give to these institutions before you give them, so we can provide some feedback so that you really are putting your best foot forward. So some resources, the Trade Commissioner website, where there we'll have regional reports on climate finance. We've done regional reports on Caribbean, on Africa, on I think Southeast Asia as well. Overview of the IFI work in climate finance and in key contacts for all of us and the trade commissioners, whether it's on the OLIFI side or on the climate finance side. And then Canada overall has international climate finance website where there's an overview of Canada's climate finance commitments. How is that $2.65 billion being utilized, and how we work with different institutions such as the World Bank Group. And then finally, we have an Understanding Climate Finance podcast. This is a short form podcast where I have the opportunity to interview investment officers, specialists, and decision makers within the World Bank Group and IFC. And in fact, Shari was one of our first people that we had interviewed. And so I certainly encourage you to look at that or listen to that podcast. They're about 20 minutes or so to really get a better understanding of what it is to work with the IFC and some of these other institutions. So with that, thank you very much. I know my contact information will be shared, but I'm really excited to pass it over to Shari Friedman, who I mentioned has been a really key contact for us and really helpful for Canadian companies in her capacity within the climate finance, the climate business unit within the IFC. So Shari, over to you.
Hi, thank you. Thanks so much. I'd just like to first say thank you to Dina and the Chamber of Commerce for having me, and a huge thank you also to Laura and Faheem for making a great introduction to IFC, and of course for your partnership. But you've just, with your introduction, have made my job very easy. I am Shari Friedman. I'm Senior Climate Strategy Officer and Acting Manager for Climate Business and Strategy. And I've worked in climate and sustainability for around 25 years in a lot of different capacities, kind of moving between the public and the private sector. And at IFC, I work to both build IFC's business and also to integrate climate throughout IFC. And I also, similar to Faheem, I hosted another podcast and was very happy to join Faheem's podcast. And I'll kind of point out as I go through my presentation where you might be able to find additional resources from Faheem's podcast, because he has spoken with several of my colleagues. Today, I really want to talk to you about the opportunities that we're seeing in climate business in general, to get you an idea of kind of where we're thinking and where we're going with climate business, and then to have a discussion. I'm very interested to hearing from you and having a discussion about how we can collaborate further. So starting off, this is just the big picture of IFC. And I think, again, Laura and Faheem really teed it up well. IFC comprises about little under 15% of all World Bank Group long-term commitments. And in some ways, IFC operates very similarly to a commercial bank. When we kind of look at colleagues and put ourselves in a category, that's sort of where we put ourselves. We do loans, equity, trade, short-term finance, et cetera. We also have a venture capital group. When I was looking through the list, I saw some companies that look like you might be interested in venture capital. And we do have a group there that does regular venture capital and climate finance, VC. Most of what we do is on commercial terms, similar to other commercial banks. But IFC will also, the difference is that IFC will also often go to locations where other commercial banks are less comfortable going, fragile and conflicted states, or sometimes just into situations that will make other commercial banks uncomfortable, but our terms tend to generally be commercial. But IFC does do things that other commercial banks don't do. We have tools that other commercial banks don't tend to have access to, because primarily we are a development bank, and our mission is the same as a poverty alleviation mission, similar to the rest of the World Bank Group. And our mission in the private sector piece is to open markets. So here are some of the tools that we have, and I'll get into these a little bit more. We have blended concessional finance, which both Laura and Faheem have alluded to. And I have to say here, Canada has been a phenomenal partner. They have been groundbreaking in the way that Canada has approached blended concessional finance in a very market-based way. So we have a lot of appreciation for that partnership. What blended concessional finance does is we take our commercial finance and we blend it with concessional finance that can buy down a perceived or a real risk. And it's in situations where we see doing this will overcome a barrier that then opens a market. So it's not meant to subsidize a deal. It's meant to kind of catalyze additional finance coming into a particular market. And I have to say again, with Faheem's podcast, Faheem had interviewed Cruzcaya Sierra Escalante, who runs our blended finance group, and on his podcast, Understanding Climate Finance. So if you want to do a deeper dive into there, I would suggest checking that out. We also do advisory, where we work with, again, it's similar to wanting to open up a market. If the barrier is that there needs to be a better understanding of pieces. So I'll give you an example. It's hard to explain without an example. When we're doing in finance through financial institutions, sometimes it's hard for the financial institutions to have line of sight into their pipeline, or to understand how to create the way to calculate and monitor their climate investments for on lending. And so we have a group that can work with a bank to be able to develop that internal capacity. And then that creates, that overcomes that barrier. And then we step out and everything kind of flows on a commercial basis. We have advisory on green buildings. We have advisory on renewable energy, on distributed generation. So a lot of capacity to do this. We also, as part of the World Bank group, we have access to guarantees through MEGA. And increasingly, IFC is working in what we call upstream, which frankly in climate we realized was probably not the right term to use, because people then think that we're doing like upstream, fossil fuels. But the upstream to us means that we're working not at the point of investment, but before that, and what it takes. We're looking at where the new markets are and how we can accelerate those markets. And I'll get to why we want to accelerate, particularly in climate, so fast. So next slide, please. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the regions, but I just wanted to point out that as Laura had mentioned, we work across all regions. This is more or less a breakdown, but frankly, it varies by year. Sometimes we'll have chunky investments in one region or another. But as Laura said, we have local capacity in all of these regions to do business. Next slide. So this really just is kind of our focus areas and our focus themes. We work across almost every different type of investment, whereas a lot of multilateral development banks really focus in on infrastructure. We also do agribusiness. We do investments through financial institutions. We do manufacturing. We do short-term trade finance. So a lot of different types of finance, pretty much everything, venture capital also, as I had mentioned. Our major themes that we do, so this is kind of cross-cutting and where we are really trying to build to make sure that our investments are furthering these different themes, is in climate finance, is in fragility, and in digital economy. These are things that we feel underpin development across all regions. And then the cross-cutting themes, as Laura also mentioned, gender is a really big one for us. Disruptive technologies, which is where our VC group comes in, developing and launching capital markets, and scaling mobilization, which I'll get to in a moment. And we can move on to the next one. So now that was kind of IFC in general, and now I just wanted to talk about climate. And what you see here are stats on climate business. And so I want to just take a step back and define what we mean when we say climate business. Climate business are the investments that we do that are kind of above and beyond in terms of climate. They're what we see transforming the markets. So if you kind of see the emissions trajectory, you see all these projections of the emissions trajectory going upwards. It's the investments that will actively bend the curve down on emissions. So that's stuff like renewable energy, or if you're doing something if you're doing a cement plant and you put in a technology like a waste heat recovery system inside of that, or if you're doing a cement plant that is doing a green type of cement. It's the stuff that's a little above and beyond what is normal business as usual, but that helps to create the solutions for climate across all these different sectors we'll get to in a second. So you'll see the graph on the upper left. We had kind of an outlier in 2018. We had a couple of really huge deals, but if you look at the general trend, we're trending upwards, right? And what you'll see is, and just to define own account and mobilization, own account is where we're placing our own capital, which again are shareholders, which are provided by the countries and the shareholders. And then the mobilization is the piece that we actively bring in. It's not the extra amount of money that comes along, that just happens to come along to the project. It is the capital that we, through syndications or through other means, actively bring in through our partnerships into the deal. And that's one of the key benefits of working with IFC, is that we have a whole machine that helps us to bring capital along with us. So going over to the graph on the lower right-hand corner, what you're seeing there is, could you hold on just 1 second? Sorry. What you're seeing in the lower right is a graph that shows the diversity over years. When we started doing climate business, what we were really doing, we were mostly doing renewable energy, if you look at the lower bottom. But the green bar is the renewable energy, and we keep doing renewable energy, but everything else is really growing. We now have a very big business through FIs. We do have a big business through agribusiness. And the main point here is that there are opportunities to do climate business in any investment that we make. Almost everything has an opportunity to do climate business. So I want to go into the next slide, which kind of touches on something that Faheem was getting at, which is that if you look at this isn't specific to IFC. This is kind of where the world is moving and what we're seeing in terms of the trajectory. But the reason I wanted to put this up is it kind of gives you the perspective of IFC's perspective on climate and why we think this is so urgent. And of course, it's not only urgent to us, this is what all countries and companies are looking at. And so the next few years are going to be really, really crucial in terms of climate. The IPCC report that came out a few years ago that said that we need to reduce, we need to really change the ship around by 2030 and get down to net zero by 2050 has completely changed the way that people think about what needs to be done and how fast we need to do it. So countries are making plans to reduce their emissions through NDCs and LTSs, and lenders, including IFC, are looking at climate, not necessarily as something that's kind of nice to do, but as a premise and a part of our financial due diligence. And I'll get to that in just a second. If we can go to the next slide. So what are we doing? So IFC is going to increase our climate finance, which is what we kind of were talking about on 2 slides ago. We're going to mobilize more. And I will say on increasing our climate finance and mobilizing more, IFC is planning on increasing our overall share of investment in general and of mobilization in general. So we're increasing by 30 to 35% from our prior target of around 28%. But because our baseline investments are going to be so big, this could be almost a doubling of IFC's overall capital that's going over toward climate finance. So we're hoping that it will be catalytic in a lot of different markets. I want to get to this last piece because this is kind of important. This part of Paris alignment. I just realized it says we'll be aligned, but it doesn't say aligned with what. Sorry. So this 85% of new direct operations will be aligned to the Paris Agreement starting July 1st, 2023, and 100% starting July 1st, 2025. This is for new direct investments. And what this is, the way that this differs from climate finance is that it is kind of the baseline. It is not, so we said 35% will be climate finance. That's the stuff that bends the curve. This is the baseline. This is making sure that the other 65% does not harm the curve of trying to get the globe toward net zero. So we're not doing great things on one hand and then doing stuff that is against this trajectory that we've stated we wanted to be on. So how are we going to do this? And I feel like this is a really important piece for people to understand because it's kind of going to, in the future, it's going to be one of the entry points into doing investments with the IFC. And so what it is, the MDBs, all of the multilateral development banks, have developed a methodology for how to assess climate finance. We're road testing it right now, and it's going to be public shortly, what those methodologies are. But I can tell you more or less what they are is that it's going to be, are these investments in line with the NDCs, which is the country plans of how they're committing to align with the Paris Agreement? Are they in line with the long-term strategies for countries doing it, long-term strategies for countries on how they are going to bend their own curve? And are they in line more or less with general industry trends? And this is not, again, it's not climate finance. It's not going above and beyond. What it is just making sure that it's doing no harm. So you don't have to be in the NDC. You don't have to be part of the solution, but you have to not be counter to what the country or counter to what the general trends are. So I just want to leave that there, and I'm happy to answer other questions about it. But I want to also mention these are the sectors that we're focused on. And if you look at these sectors and you're like, well, that's kind of everything. It is kind of everything, because climate, like I said, there's climate opportunities across the board. So we see a lot of opportunities in clean energy, in climate smart cities, which includes green buildings, where we've really built a very good business, and we have great tools, including the EDGE tool, manufacturing, green transport, a lot in EVs, I think, in green transport is going to come out, climate smart agribusiness, both on the adaptation and on the mitigation side. I don't want to spend a lot on this slide, but this is kind of when we talk about the fact that we're seeing opportunities, this is where we're seeing them. And what we see our role is to make this happen and make this happen fast. So this slide, I'm not going to really walk through this slide. It's a lot of detail. This is what we call our kind of McKinsey format slides, where you put a lot of words in a slide. But what this really shows you is examples. You know, this is, and I understand you probably will be getting the slide deck, and that's why I put this in here so you can take a look at it. But this is what we mean when we say this is a clean energy investment. This is a green finance. This is what a green buildings investment looks like. And what we mean when we say we're working upstream and how we're trying to open markets. And I want to go on to the next slide. Oh, sorry. So I think we might be 2 slides back. Could you go 1 slide to the next slide? Yeah, this is the one I was talking about, that is the McKinsey oriented slide. So this shows you what we mean when we're doing climate business in general. These are the types of projects that we do and what we mean when we're doing upstream. And if you go on to the next slide. So these are the new technologies that we're seeing that we think this is the next step. This is where we're seeing big market potential. We're going to keep doing the bread and butter and keep opening the markets. We're not leaving the stuff that we've had great expertise in, green buildings, renewable energy, and large scale. But here's where we see that the next technologies are going to be. And again, a lot of these you can visit Faheem's podcast. I've also covered a lot of these on my podcast. You know, Faheem's covered offshore wind. He's also covered battery storage. But on all of these, on some of these, IFC has already placed investment capital. You know, for example, electric vehicles. We've placed it on energy storage and distributed generation. Some of these we've invested at scale, but also see new markets like green buildings, but now we're moving into zero carbon buildings. And then some of them we haven't quite invested yet, but the technology could be there and it could be hugely revolutionary. That's like hydrogen, green hydrogen, and also offshore wind. I think we're seeing huge potential. So again, if you want to hear more about these, I would check out the different podcasts. So I want to just wrap it up here. And I imagine there's probably a lot of questions. And so I want to just pass it back to the rest of the panel to see how we can partner better. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Shari, as well as Laura and Faheem. So we are now at the questions period. So you're invited to write down your question in the Q&A box, and please make sure you indicate who you're asking your question to. So we already received a few questions. So our first question for Faheem, does the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service help Canadian companies looking into import goods for local consumptions? And maybe another question at the same time, Dalila Lagmati is asking also, what size of companies are you working with?
Yeah, so good questions. We can help direct you to those appropriate resources. We are focused on helping Canadian companies look for opportunities outside of Canada. but we're happy if you email me specifically what you're looking at. We can help direct you to the right agency within the Canadian government. What size of companies? It certainly varies. The process with the Trade Commissioner service is that you will talk with a local trade commissioner, and they'll look at to see if you qualify as a client. So, you're a legitimate Canadian business that's providing economic impact to Canada, and then we'll sort of go from there. Then they'll typically refer opportunities to us where, let's say, you are looking at climate finance opportunities in emerging markets, or let's say, for example, you want to start specifically exporting to a part of the United States, then they'll connect you to the Trade Commissioner at one of our missions, which is the most relevant to you.
Thank you. There's another question, maybe it's also related, from Claude Marquis. Specifically, how can you help a company in the paramedical skincare sector for export and financing?
Yeah, so in that case, I would again reach out to the local trade commissioner. One thing I do want to mention is that the Trade Commissioner service isn't a financing institution. We're really focused on business development. We have small pockets of financing but related to like trade opportunities. When you're looking at export financing, that's really where you'd want to work with EDC.
Thank you. Our next question from Robert Van Beers is asking if we think we have qualifying projects that ought to attract IFC support, how and with whom should we start that discussion and support IFC's due diligence?
So I know Robert and I have worked together quite a bit. So Robert, feel free to contact me, and we can talk through and then see who the right contacts are within IFC.
Thank you. So next question from Benoit Theroux. And I think I will answer. So the question Benoit is asking if we can have contacts, information, and website to read and establish contact, and emails to participants. So Benoit, yes. You will be receiving the slides and the presentation from my part tomorrow at the same time. And in the slides, you will have the contact information to reach out to our panelists today. And we will be more than happy if you email me. I can put you in contact with Faheem's team as well. And you will have also my email in the follow-up email or on the webpage of the event.
And look, can I just add, I answered one of the questions and I put a link into the Q&A on one of the answered questions to our website.
Okay, it was George Brenzil's questions. Where do we get the regional reports on climate finance mentioned by Faheem? Yes, so everyone can see the link now. So you can also refer to that as an external link for more information. We have a question from Bart Edesh. Hi, Bart. Does IFC plan to collaborate with FINDEV Canada in Africa or here in the Western Hemisphere? Maybe if Shari, I'll invite you if you...
Sure, I can comment on that as well, Dina.
Okay.
Maybe I'll start, and then Shari, if you wanted to add anything. Just thanks for the question, Bart, and great to hear you're participating today. Absolutely, we've already established really strong linkages between FINDEV Canada and the International Finance Corporation. I'm delighted in my role I was able to help make some of the initial introductions. Exciting news is that there is a new CEO of FINDEV Canada, Laurie Kerr, who also knows IFC well. And that's wonderful news, as we do expect we'll continue to see a strong partnership. I know there are strong interests on both sides, and a joint agreement to look at active investments that would fit both of their respective mandates. A particular focus on gender, given the mandate of FINDEV Canada, but also, as you mentioned, in the African continent, where that is a priority region, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. So we're hoping that we will see continued close collaboration. Of course, our office is on standby to help make sure that we can support those efforts. And then Shari, if you wanted to comment as well, just knowing that climate is also a priority for FINDEV, if there's anything that you wanted to also add to.
No, I think you covered it. I will say though that Africa is another priority region for IFC. So I see as there's a lot of intersection between FINDEV Canada's priorities and IFC's priorities. And as Laura just mentioned, the new CEO of FINDEV Canada knows IFC incredibly well. And so I do see a lot of opportunities moving forward.
And I'll just add, yesterday they launched their 2020 annual report. So if you go to the FINDEV Canada site, you'll probably get a copy or see a link to that event that happened yesterday.
Thank you.
And Faheem, was the report, I couldn't see the report that you put in, was that the climate finance report, the MDB climate finance report, or was it something different?
No, it was just a general link to climate finance. So we've commissioned a number of different reports.
Okay, because I could also suggest that there, and I'm happy to send a link. I'll send it over to Dina, and you could distribute it with the information. But there's a link to every year the multilateral development banks come out with a joint report on climate finance, on what all of the everybody does, and we have similar methodologies, so it's pretty much apples to apples, and you'll be able to see who's doing what, both in climate finance and in mobilization. And there's a lot of different breakdowns by sector, by adaptation versus mitigation. It's a really good report.
Absolutely, I'll be happy to share with our participants here today. Also, I wanted to add, if you're interested in Africa, we have another webinar coming up next week on June 23rd. It will be in French on the energy portfolio in West Africa of the World Bank Group. It's a little different, but if you're interested in that sector, it's next week. The webinar will be in French. And I see we have another question. Christian Philippe. Okay, yes, the slide will be sent to you tomorrow. So make sure you check your inbox. You will receive the email from me, from a Zoom email. Okay, so I think we have no more questions. I might just ask one question here, just one more question. If a firm is interested in a particular program, who should they contact if they have a question, and how can they engage with the IFC staff in general? Maybe Faheem and Laura, if you can maybe explain them the PSLO network, what it's here for, and also like how we can, what's the connection between you and the IFC staff, so we can conclude.
Sure. Laura, would you like to go ahead, and then I can.
Okay, sure. So thank you so much. Great question, and really great to hear the interest in follow-up, which is always a good sign of a great webinar. So I just wanted to confirm that, yes, our office does work so closely with our partners. We do have a private sector liaison officer network, and Canada is very actively participating in this network with the World Bank Group. Thankfully, we do have Dina in Montreal there as the main point of contact on that end in that role. And also, as mentioned, with the Global Affairs Canada, the entire Trade Commissioner service is really our key go-to. Faheem's role in particular as the Climate Finance Trade Commissioner would be a very appropriate point of contact to help you navigate next steps, particularly related to climate. and IFC, but also in terms of a broader lens with the Office of Liaison with the International Financial Institutions, the IFI office, as we refer to it, as you mentioned, also at the Canadian Embassy. Our office works closely with them. We do tend to receive the inquiries sort of as follow-up from their initial vetting, just to make sure that they've done the initial point of contact, and then we can help support their efforts. So I would suggest that. And as was mentioned, just to really encourage everyone to take a look at much of the information that's readily available online. So we'll be sure to send along some links as well. There's additional information we can share on IFC sort of investment cycle, so that you would be well apprised as to what that looks like for those of you making investments in developing countries in the private sector. Certainly we can share that with you, the types of eligibility as well as outlined on the websites. And as Shari had mentioned, also just for IFC performance standards, it's also really important to take a look at those at the outset. These are very well established standards that are really setting the bar for industry. So you'd want to be very familiar with those as well prior to engaging directly with IFC staff. But with that, over to you, Faheem.
Yeah, I think you had mentioned it. I think the best first contact is with myself, Leah, and Julie, who are in the IFI office, where we can talk through some of the opportunities and really give you a sense of where you should go, and then of course provide the right contacts and make sure that you're putting your best foot forward.
Well, thank you very much, Shari, Laura, and Faheem, for your excellent presentations today. Thanks to the World Bank Group, IFC, and the Canada Trade Commissioner Service for this collaboration. So thanks as well to our partners, Desjardins, or collaborators EDC and La Presse, as well as Economic Development Agency of Canada for the regions of Quebec. So on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce of Metropolitan Montreal, I wish you all a good day and hope to see you at our next events. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much. Merci à tous.
Merci.